It was late October when the group of explorers arrived in Alaska, a place known for its untamed beauty and ruthless wilderness. The harsh, biting cold immediately greeted them as they stepped off the plane, sending a chill through their bones. The icy wind cut through their clothes, and they could already feel the weight of the isolation setting in. In every direction, a vast expanse of snow-covered mountains stretched endlessly, the world around them seemingly frozen in time. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by civilization, and for some reason, that fact gave them an uneasy feeling. They were seasoned adventurers, accustomed to the dangers of extreme environments. But Alaska was different. The wilderness here had a reputation, one that carried a dark undertone. They had all heard the rumors, stories of strange disappearances, whispers in the wind, and unexplained events that had haunted locals for generations. The tales were mostly dismissed as superstition by outsiders. But those who had lived here for any length of time spoke of things that couldn't be explained, things that didn't belong. Yet, for some reason, Carl, the leader of the team, was determined to ignore those warnings. Carl had assembled this team for one reason: to uncover the truth behind the mysterious lost expedition of 1953. This group of explorers had vanished without a trace, their last known whereabouts somewhere deep in the Alaskan wilderness. No one had ever figured out what happened to them. Some said they simply got lost. Others believed they'd been caught by an unexpected storm, but there were whispers that something more sinister was at play. For decades, the mystery had haunted the area, and Carl, along with his team, was convinced that there was more to the story. This wasn't just another case of bad luck in the harsh environment. They were determined to prove something else, something darker, something that had been hidden away in the shadows for far too long. As Carl looked out over the frozen landscape, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. He wasn't scared, not exactly, but he knew they were about to embark on something that would test their limits. Alaska's wilderness wasn't a place to take lightly. And even though the team had done their research and prepared for months, Carl couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were walking into a trap. But the drive to solve the mystery, to uncover the truth of what had happened. The team, made up of 5 skilled adventurers, had spent the better part of the day setting up camp in the remote area they had chosen to begin their search. They had carefully selected a spot that was close enough to the area where the lost expedition had last been heard from, but far enough to avoid disturbing any existing search efforts. The conditions were brutal, with freezing temperatures and winds that could tear the skin off your face. But they were prepared. They knew what they were up against. At least, that's what they told themselves. As night fell, the team gathered around the campfire. The flickering flames offered some warmth, but not much. The fire crackled and popped, the only sound against the howling wind that seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. They huddled together, pulling their coats tighter around them and speaking in hushed tones, as if the mountains themselves were listening. The stories of the lost expedition had been circulating for years, but tonight they felt different. The air was thick with a sense of something unseen, a presence just beyond the edge of the firelight. Carl could feel the tension in the air, not just from the cold, but from something else. It was almost as if the very mountains were alive, watching them, waiting for something. He glanced around at his team. Dave, the quiet one, was staring into the flames, his face unreadable. Sarah, the only woman on the team, seemed more nervous than usual, her eyes darting around the camp, as if expecting something to appear out of the darkness. Mark, the youngest member, was doing his best to crack jokes, but even his usual bravado couldn't mask the anxiety in his voice. But Carl didn't want to show weakness. He had to keep them focused, keep them moving forward. They were here to find answers, and that's exactly what they were going to do. "All right, everyone," he said, breaking the silence. "Let's review the plan for tomorrow. We head out at dawn, and we start searching the area where the lost expedition was last seen. The weather forecast says we'll have clear skies for the next few days, so we need to make the most of it." The group nodded in agreement, though Carl noticed that none of them seemed eager to head back out into the wilderness. They were all good at pretending everything was fine, but Carl could see the fear in their eyes. It was the kind of fear that came from uncertainty, from not knowing what lay ahead. And deep down, Carl couldn't help but feel it too. The wind continued to howl outside the warmth of their little camp, almost as if it were a warning. Carl leaned back against a log, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He tried to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was the legend surrounding the lost expedition. But there was a strange sense of dread settling over him. It wasn't just the weather or the remoteness of the place. It was something deeper. The very wilderness felt alive, as if it were watching them, judging them. The silence that followed each gust of wind felt oppressive, like 1,000 unspoken words pressing down on them. Carl glanced at the others, who were all staring into the fire, lost in their own thoughts. None of them spoke for a long time. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind, which had now reached a deafening roar. It almost felt as though the mountains were trying to communicate something to them, some warning they weren't picking up on. Then, just as Carl was about to speak again, the wind howled louder than he had ever heard before. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of their camp, leaving a bone-chilling emptiness in its wake. The flames of the fire flickered and danced, casting long shadows across the snow. But the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if reaching toward them. For a moment, everything was still. Carl felt a shiver run down his spine. The mountains were not just a backdrop to their expedition. They were a presence, a living, breathing entity, and they didn't want them here. A sudden gust of wind blasted through the camp, knocking over their supplies and sending snow swirling into the fire, causing it to flicker and almost go out. Everyone jumped to their feet, scrambling to regain control. But even as they worked, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. "We need to get some sleep," Carl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." But as they settled into their tents, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains weren't going to let them sleep. The wilderness had called them here, and now it seemed it had no intention of letting them leave. The morning after their first night in the Alaskan wilderness dawned colder than expected. The sun barely managed to break through the thick layer of clouds, casting a faint, ghostly glow over the snow-covered landscape. The team had already packed up their camp and begun to prepare for the day ahead. But something was off. It wasn't just the biting cold or the ever-present wind that had been howling throughout the night. It was the feeling that something wasn't quite right, something they couldn't put their fingers on. At first, it was little things. Their GPS systems began to malfunction. They had been relying on the device to track their position and guide them through the terrain. But as they checked their coordinates that morning, the screen froze. No matter how many times they rebooted it, the system remained unresponsive. Carl cursed under his breath, trying to keep his frustration in check. He'd expected challenges in the wilderness, but he hadn't expected their technology to fail so quickly. Then the radios began acting up. The static, once a mild nuisance, now seemed to grow louder with every attempt to communicate. They tried different channels, fiddled with the frequency, but nothing worked. The crackling noise filled the air, as if the very airwaves were distorted. The team members exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. It wasn't just faulty equipment. Something was interfering with their signal. The communications were being blocked, or worse, tampered with. And the weather, the weather, changed with a swiftness that was almost unnatural. 1 minute, it was a clear, crisp day, the sun just barely peeking through the clouds, giving them enough light to navigate. The next, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped sharply. A thick fog rolled in from the mountains, so dense that visibility dropped to almost nothing. The air became heavy, thick with moisture and a biting chill that seemed to freeze them to their very core. It felt as though the weather was shifting in ways that no forecast had predicted, as though the land itself was alive, manipulating their environment to disorient them. The team pushed on, despite the increasing unease that seemed to settle over them like a fog. They had come this far, and Carl wasn't about to let something as trivial as malfunctioning equipment and strange weather stop them. But even as they trekked deeper into the wilderness, the atmosphere felt thicker, the silence louder. It wasn't the natural silence of the woods. It was an oppressive quiet, as if the world itself had gone mute. They were being watched, and they all felt it, though no one dared speak the thought aloud. As the day wore on, Carl kept his focus, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the stories they had heard in the small town before setting out. The locals had warned them, in hushed tones, about the things that lurked in the deep Alaskan wilderness, things that shouldn't be in the natural world. Carl had dismissed it all as superstition, the kind of talk that accompanied every remote location. But now, as they moved further into the desolate, snow-covered landscape, he couldn't shake the feeling that the stories weren't just stories. It was Sarah, the youngest member of the team, who first mentioned seeing something. She was always the most perceptive of the group, quick to notice things that others might overlook. As they stopped for a break, Sarah stood at the edge of their camp, her eyes scanning the forest with an intensity that immediately caught Carl's attention.
"There's something out there,"
she said quietly, almost to herself. Her voice, usually calm and collected, trembled slightly as she spoke. Carl followed her gaze, but all he saw was the dense wall of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The snow was too thick, the shadows too deep. He saw nothing. "Something?" he asked, trying to mask the concern in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Sarah's voice faltered. "It's like a shadow moving between the trees. It's watching us." The team looked at each other, the mood shifting in an instant. Mark scoffed nervously, trying to lighten the atmosphere. "It's probably just a deer or some other animal. You know how the shadows play tricks in the snow." But Sarah shook her head. "No, this wasn't an animal. It was different." They all tried to laugh it off, attributing it to Sarah's overactive imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you're deep in the wilderness and your mind starts to play tricks on you. But even as they spoke, they all felt a flicker of unease, a small seed of doubt planted in their minds. Sarah wasn't the type to make things up, and whatever it was she had seen, it had left a lingering feeling that no one could shake. As night began to fall, the team decided to settle in for the evening, setting up camp in a small clearing. But Sarah wasn't ready to sleep. She had been visibly shaken by the experience, her mind clearly racing with thoughts she couldn't quite express. She kept glancing over her shoulder, eyes scanning the trees as though expecting something to appear at any moment. "I need to clear my head," she said suddenly. "I'm going for a walk." Carl raised an eyebrow, concerned. "It's getting dark. You should stay close to camp." But Sarah was already pulling on her jacket, her face set with determination. "I'll be fine. I just need to get some air." Before anyone could stop her, she walked off into the trees, her figure quickly swallowed by the growing darkness. Carl hesitated for a moment, watching her go, but then turned back to the fire, trying to push aside the growing unease in his gut. The wind had picked up again, the trees groaning in the distance. But there was something else in the air. A tension that was hard to explain. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They didn't hear from Sarah that night. The team tried to sleep, but none of them were able to. The wind howled louder than ever before, rattling the tent walls and making them feel as though they were in the center of a storm. Carl lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent, his mind racing with thoughts of Sarah. Why hadn't she returned? It had been hours, and the temperature was plummeting fast. She had to know how dangerous it was to wander alone in these conditions. The next morning, panic set in. Sarah was still missing. They searched the area where she had last been seen, but there was no sign of her. Her footprints in the snow were visible at first, leading away from the camp and toward the forest. But then they abruptly stopped near the base of an old abandoned shack. The tracks seemed to vanish, as though she had simply disappeared into thin air. Carl's heart sank as he scanned the area, hoping against hope that he would see some sign of Sarah, a clue, anything. But there was nothing. The snow was too deep for her to have wandered far, and the shack was old, its walls decaying with age. No one had been inside for years. They spent hours searching the area, calling out her name, but there was no answer. The eerie silence of the wilderness pressed down on them, as though the very land had swallowed her up. Carl's mind raced with questions. Had she wandered off? Had she gotten lost? Or was something else responsible for her disappearance? There was a sense of foreboding that hung over the team, a dread that settled in their bones. Something was wrong, and whatever had taken Sarah was still out there, waiting for the next to disappear. The loss of Sarah had left the team rattled, a cloud of dread hanging over them as they continued their journey. Despite the deep unease that had settled in, they pushed forward, driven by the need to find answers. But as the days dragged on, the wilderness seemed to grow more hostile, as if the land itself was trying to drive them away. The cold winds swept through the trees like whispers, eerie and unnatural, and the once familiar sound of the wilderness, the wind, the rustling of animals, was replaced by something more unsettling. There were strange noises in the distance at night, not the sounds of wildlife, but something else entirely. It was as if the land itself had come alive, echoing with voices, faint and distorted, just out of reach. The team would sit around the campfire, but even the flames felt insufficient against the growing sense of fear that gnawed at them. The days felt long and drawn out, each one heavier than the last. Carl knew they couldn't turn back now. They had to keep moving, or they would all go insane from the isolation. But the feeling that they were being watched, that they were not alone, was impossible to shake. The wilderness wasn't empty. It never had been. And whatever it was that had taken Sarah seemed to be waiting for them, lurking just beyond the edge of their sight. One evening, after another grueling day of travel, Carl found himself alone outside the camp. He had wandered away from the others, needing some space to clear his mind. The fire had dimmed, leaving the camp shrouded in shadow, and the wind had started to pick up again. It wasn't just the biting cold this time. It was something else, a presence in the air that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The wind felt wrong, like it carried with it a warning. Carl sat on a large rock, his breath clouding in the frigid air, his mind a whirl of confusion and fear. It was hard to keep his thoughts straight. Everything about this place felt off, and the more he thought about Sarah's disappearance, the more the unanswered questions seemed to pile up. Had she simply wandered off and gotten lost? Or had something otherworldly taken her? The idea had seemed ridiculous when they first started their journey. But now, with each passing day, Carl felt the grip of that possibility tightening around him. The trees rustled softly in the wind, and for a moment, Carl thought he saw a shadow flit between the trunks. He stood, heart racing, his breath catching in his throat. The darkness of the forest felt oppressive, the night swallowing the landscape whole. Carl took a few steps forward, his boots crunching in the snow, his eyes scanning the trees. It was almost as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. He paused for a moment, trying to steady his pulse. His eyes scanned the horizon again, but he saw nothing. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches sway and creak, but the landscape was still. Too still. And then, through the trees, he saw it. A figure. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a shadow moving slowly through the snow. It was walking at a deliberate pace, its figure thin and hunched, like someone trudging through the deep snow. But as it drew closer, Carl's breath hitched in his chest. It wasn't the shape of any person he knew. The figure's face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light, its skin stretched tightly over its bones. It was moving with a slow, deliberate motion, each step dragging through the snow like something heavy and exhausted. Carl's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of disbelief and terror flooding his senses. His first instinct was to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure didn't seem to notice him. It moved as if it was alone in the world, oblivious to anything around it. Carl took a step forward, his body moving before his mind could fully catch up. The figure didn't stop, didn't react in any way. The distance between them closed with each step Carl took, his feet crunching in the snow, his breath coming faster. It was then that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The figure wasn't leaving footprints in the snow. It was as if the snow was simply erasing its presence behind it. No prints, no trace. Carl's feet felt frozen to the ground, but he couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop the pull he felt toward the figure. He was almost close enough to reach out, to touch it, to make sure it was real. But just as he was within arm's reach, the figure stopped, its head tilting toward him. The movement was unnatural, jerky, like a marionette with invisible strings. Carl's breath caught in his throat, his legs suddenly weak. The air around him felt colder, sharper, as if the very space between them had frozen solid. The figure's pale, expressionless face turned toward him, its eyes wide open but empty. There were no pupils, no warmth, just endless blackness. Carl's stomach lurched, and for a moment, he felt as though he was drowning in the gaze of this thing. Whatever it was like staring into the abyss, into something that had no place in this world. And then, before Carl could move, before he could even think, the figure took a step backward. It moved with such unnatural speed that Carl barely had time to react. One moment, the figure was standing before him, and the next, it had disappeared, vanished into the trees without a sound, as though it had never been there at all. Carl stood frozen, his heart racing, his mind spinning. He tried to rationalize what had just happened, but nothing made sense. He wasn't imagining things. He had seen it, felt it, It wasn't a trick of the light, and it wasn't some wild hallucination brought on by the stress and cold. No, this was something real, something dead. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and Carl stumbled back toward the camp, his body trembling with fear and disbelief. He didn't know what he had seen, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't the last time he would see it. Back at the camp, the others were sitting around the fire, their faces drawn and weary. Mark looked up as Carl approached, noticing the look on his face. Carl didn't say anything at first. He couldn't. He couldn't find the words to explain what he had just witnessed, what he had just felt. "Carl?" Mark asked, his voice laced with concern. Carl shook his head, his throat tight. I saw something." Mark's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean? What did you see?" Carl swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he slowly sat down by the fire. "I saw a figure moving through the snow. It didn't leave any footprints, and its face..." He broke off, unable to finish the sentence. The others were watching him now, their faces a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Carl, are you sure you're okay?" Dave asked. "You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you just imagined it." Carl looked at them, his eyes wide, filled with a terror that was impossible to ignore. "It wasn't a hallucination," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was real." The camp fell silent, the wind howling louder than ever. They all sat around the fire, the shadows of the trees creeping ever closer, and in that moment, Carl knew that whatever was out there in the wilderness, it wasn't going to stop. It had seen them, and it was coming for them. The deeper the team ventured into the wilderness, the more the landscape seemed to change. The air grew colder with each passing hour, and the silence that once enveloped the land was now punctuated by something else, an unsettling presence that seemed to be lingering just out of reach. It was as if the very wilderness itself had taken on a life of its own, responding to their intrusion. The further they pushed into the snow-covered expanse, the more distorted their perception of reality became. At night, when the team huddled around their campfire, things grew even stranger. The wind had become their constant companion, and it seemed to carry more than just the cold. It carried voices, low, murmuring whispers that swirled around the camp like an invisible fog. The first time they heard it, they thought it was just the wind playing tricks. The noise was faint, barely audible over the howling gusts, but it wasn't long before it became impossible to ignore. The whispers weren't the sound of the wind, not the natural, familiar rustling of trees in a storm. No, these were distinct, almost human-like voices, speaking in a language that none of them could understand. Carl listened carefully, straining his ears against the wind. He was certain he wasn't imagining it. The sounds were real, though their origin remained unclear. The voices seemed to echo from the trees, or perhaps from the very earth itself, seeping up through the cracks in the ice. It felt like they were being surrounded, like the wilderness was speaking to them, communicating something they couldn't quite comprehend. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. It was not friendly. The murmurs had an almost mocking quality to them, as though whatever was watching them knew exactly who they were and why they were there. The team tried to block it out at first. They told themselves it was just their minds playing tricks, that the isolation was making them paranoid. But the whispers grew louder as the days went on, always there, always present. No matter how much they tried to focus on their tasks, no matter how hard they tried to ignore it, the sound of murmurs filled the air, following them like a shadow. It was as though the land itself was rejecting them, warning them to leave. The closer they got to their goal, the more the whispers grew, growing in intensity, until they could no longer deny that something or someone was trying to communicate with them.
Carl was the first to break. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, followed by unseen eyes. His instincts told him they weren't alone in this wilderness. There was something out there, something ancient, something that had seen the passing of time in these cold, harsh lands. He wasn't sure if it was the spirits of the past explorers, the ones that had disappeared without a trace, or something far worse, something far older. But Carl was certain that whatever it was real. The whispers were not the product of exhaustion or paranoia. They were a warning. As the team continued deeper into the wilderness, the tension between them grew. What had begun as a shared sense of purpose had devolved into something darker. The constant barrage of strange noises, the freezing winds, and the oppressive atmosphere of the wilderness were starting to take their toll on everyone. People began to snap at each other. Trust was beginning to erode. The once united team had started to fracture under the pressure.
It was one of the coldest nights yet when the situation came to a head. The team had set up camp in a small clearing, hoping to get some rest before pushing on the next day. The wind howled through the trees, and the cold seemed to seep into their bones, no matter how tightly they wrapped themselves in their gear. As the others tried to sleep, Carl sat outside, staring into the dark abyss of the wilderness that surrounded them. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers were growing louder now, more insistent, and they seemed to be getting closer. Dave, one of the quieter members of the team, had been acting strange all day. He was usually the most level-headed, but lately he seemed distracted, almost as if he was hearing something the others couldn't. Carl had noticed him staring into the trees more than once, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, his movements jerky and erratic. When Carl asked him what was wrong, Dave had just shaken his head, muttering that it was nothing. But Carl wasn't convinced. Dave was hiding something, and it wasn't just the strain of the journey. That night,
As the fire flickered low, Carl noticed that Dave had slipped away from the camp. At first, he thought nothing of it. People wandered off sometimes, looking for some quiet time to think. Carl waited as long as he could, but when the wind picked up again and the darkness seemed to press in on him, he couldn't stand it any longer. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the snow, calling Dave's name. His voice was swallowed by the howling wind, but Carl wasn't deterred. He knew Dave couldn't have gotten far. The snow crunched under his boots as he trudged through the dark, his flashlight beam cutting through the night. He called out again, but there was no answer. The whispering wind was growing louder, almost drowning out his voice. The trees around him creaked and groaned, their branches swaying like fingers, reaching for him. It felt as though the wilderness itself was trying to pull him in, trying to drag him deeper into its cold, suffocating embrace. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Carl found Dave. He was kneeling in the snow, his face pale and drawn, his body stiff from the cold. His eyes were wide with fear, unblinking, as though he had seen something that had broken his very mind. He didn't seem to notice Carl at first, and when Carl reached out to touch his shoulder, Dave recoiled violently, his body trembling. "What happened?" Carl demanded, kneeling down beside him. Dave's lips trembled as he opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He stared into the distance, his eyes unseeing. When Carl shook him again, trying to get him to focus, Dave finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They're watching, waiting," he muttered, his words barely comprehensible. His breath came in ragged gasps, and Carl could see that his skin had begun to turn a deep shade of purple from frostbite. It wasn't possible for him to have been out here for more than a few hours, yet he looked like he had been exposed to the cold for days. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what Dave was saying. "Who's watching? What are you talking about?" But Dave couldn't answer. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed forward, his body sinking into the snow. Carl grabbed him, desperately trying to keep him upright, but it was no use. The whispers seemed to grow louder then, surrounding Carl like a wave of sound, as though the very trees themselves were speaking to him. He could hear them now, their words clearer, though still indecipherable. It felt as though the wind was carrying the voices of the past, the lost souls who had wandered these lands before them. Were they trying to warn him? Or was this something far darker? Something that wanted them to join the ranks of those who had vanished into the wilderness. With trembling hands, Carl dragged Dave back to camp, his mind racing with fear and confusion. What had happened to him? What had he seen out there in the dark? And most importantly, was it too late for the rest of them? The whispers were getting louder, and Carl felt the weight of something ancient, something powerful, pressing down on him. Whatever had taken Sarah was now after them all, and it wasn't going to stop until they were all gone. After Dave's terrifying breakdown, the team realized they had no other option. The wilderness was closing in around them, the cold biting at their bones, the whispers growing louder and more persistent with each passing moment. They were running low on supplies, and the constant fear that hung over them was becoming too much to bear. Despite the dangers, they made the decision to return to the abandoned shack they had passed the day before. It was their last hope for shelter, a place to rest, to regroup, to plan their next move. They couldn't afford to keep moving further into the wilderness. Not after what had happened to Sarah, not after what happened to Dave. The journey back felt even longer than the previous one. The snow seemed deeper, the trees thicker, the wind colder. They kept their eyes on the ground, their footsteps heavy and uncertain. It felt like they were being pulled toward the shack, as though the land itself was guiding them back to it. Carl couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to them, whatever was happening now, had begun in that place. The shack was no mere shelter. It was a marker, a point of no return. When they finally arrived, it looked just as it had the day before, an old, dilapidated structure standing in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by an unnatural stillness. The shack was made of rotting wood, the roof sagging under the weight of the snow that had piled on top of it. The windows were covered in ice, and the door creaked as they pushed it open. The air inside heavy with the smell of decay and mildew. It was cold inside, colder than the air outside, and Carl's breath formed clouds in front of him as he stepped into the darkness. The team entered, one by one, their eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The interior was even more unsettling than the outside. The walls were covered in strange, cryptic markings, symbols that none of them recognized were scratched into the wood. Some of them twisted and jagged, others almost elegant in their design. The markings seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if they were alive, constantly shifting and changing. Carl's gaze lingered on them for a moment too long, and he felt a shiver crawl up his spine. It was like they were being watched, as if something was inside the walls, waiting for them to look away. As they moved deeper into the shack, the air grew thick with the smell of rot. It wasn't the smell of decay from the building itself. It was something else, something organic, like the scent of something that had died long ago, but was still very much present. It clung to everything, seeping into their clothes and their skin, making it hard to breathe. The floor creaked under their weight, the wood groaning as though it was alive, as though it was trying to warn them to leave. The team tried to push forward, but the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on them. Every step they took seemed to echo in the silence, every movement amplified by the unnatural quiet that surrounded them. It felt like the shack had been abandoned for much longer than it had. It felt like it had been waiting for them, as though it had been anticipating their arrival for years. Carl led the team through the shack, his eyes scanning the corners, his mind racing. There had to be something here, something that would explain what had happened to Sarah, to Dave, something that would make sense of the whispers, the figures in the snow, the shadows that had been following them. As he turned a corner, his foot hit something soft, and he stumbled. When he looked down, he saw a journal lying on the floor. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn. The pages yellowed with age. It looked like it had been dropped there in haste, its owner having abandoned it in a hurry. Carl bent down and picked it up, brushing off the dust and grime that had accumulated on it. He flipped through the pages, the handwriting cramped and frantic, as though the author had been in a state of panic when they wrote it. The entries were scattered, some of them barely legible, others completely unreadable. But as Carl read through the journal, a sense of dread settled over him. This wasn't just any journal. It was the journal of the lost expedition, the group that had vanished without a trace all those years ago. The journal's entries grew more frantic as they went on. The writers described how the group had ventured deeper into the wilderness, just as Carl and his team had, and how things began to go wrong almost immediately. The weather turned against them, the cold growing more unbearable with each day. The strange sounds started, whispers in the wind, voices that seemed to call out to them, though no one could understand what they were saying. The explorers had tried to ignore it, tried to convince themselves it was just their minds playing tricks. But the whispers grew louder, more persistent, and the team began to unravel. The last few pages of the journal were almost completely scribbled over in panic. The handwriting was erratic, the words spilling out in a desperate attempt to document something unspeakable. One entry stood out to Carl, its words clear and terrifying. It's here. It's not the cold that kills. It's the things in the snow. They won't let us leave. Carl's breath caught in his throat as he read the words over and over again. The things in the snow. What did that mean? What was out there, lurking beneath the snow, waiting for them? The journal didn't explain. The entry was cut off abruptly, and the next page was torn out completely. Carl's hands trembled as he turned the page, hoping for some kind of answer, but there was nothing. It wasn't just the journal that was unsettling. As Carl continued to explore the shack, he noticed more signs of the lost expedition. There were personal items scattered around, old, tattered maps, worn-out boots, broken equipment. But the strangest thing of all was the fire pit in the center of the shack. It looked like it had been used recently, though the shack itself was covered in dust and neglect. The wood around the fire was blackened, but the flames had long since died. It was as if someone had been living here, watching, waiting. The team gathered around Carl, their faces pale and filled with dread as they realized the significance of what they had found. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a grave, a tomb for the lost expedition, a place where they had taken their last breaths before whatever had claimed them had finished the job. Carl stood there, staring at the journal, the last entry haunting him. The things in the snow. What if they weren't just stories? What if they were real? the whispers outside the shack, the shadows that moved in the trees, the figure Carl had seen in the snow. They weren't just hallucinations. They were a warning, and whatever had happened to the lost expedition was now happening to them. The team was quiet, their minds racing with fear and uncertainty. They had come here for answers, but they had found only more questions, more terror. They had thought they could survive, that they could find a way out of the wilderness, but now they weren't so sure. The shack was no longer just a shelter. It was a prison, a place where time had stood still, where the past was repeating itself. Carl closed the journal with a shaking hand and looked at the team. They all knew what had to be done, but no one spoke it aloud. There was no turning back now. They were caught in the same trap as the lost expedition, and whatever was out there in the wilderness, whatever had claimed them, was coming for them next. The air in the shack grew colder, the whispers louder, and Carl realized with a sickening certainty that they were not alone. The things in the snow were waiting for them. That night, as the wind howled around the shack, it felt as though the earth itself was shaking in fury. The once deep silence that had enveloped them now felt suffocating, oppressive. Every gust of wind that rattled the shack's timbers seemed to carry with it an ominous warning. The air was thick with tension, and as the flames in the fire pit flickered and cast long shadows against the walls, Carl and the remaining members of the team finally realized the terrible truth. They were not alone in the wilderness. Whatever was out there, whatever had claimed the lost expedition, was now after them. It had been following them all along, but now it was here, in the shack with them, closing in from all sides. The night was long, colder than they had ever experienced before. The temperature seemed to drop with every passing hour, and the darkness felt absolute, as though it was a living thing, pressing down on them from all directions. They could hear the wind screaming through the cracks in the shack, the wooden walls groaning under the pressure, circling the shack, as if something or someone was pacing, waiting. The creaking of the shack's old timbers was no longer just the wind. It was the sound of something moving inside, something unseen, shifting between the walls. Carl's mind was racing, trying to make sense of the horror that had enveloped them. He had heard the whispers again, louder this time, but they weren't coming from outside. They were inside the shack, surrounding them. Faint murmurs at first, indistinguishable, and then slowly becoming clearer. The words were ancient, broken fragments of a language Carl couldn't understand, but they sent a chill through his spine, filling him with dread. The air was too still, too thick, as if the very room was holding its breath. Rachel was the first to go. They had all been sitting huddled together in the corner of the shack, clutching their gear, eyes wide with terror. When Rachel had stood up suddenly, her body tense and rigid, as though she were compelled to move by some invisible force. She staggered toward the door, her eyes glazed over, as though she wasn't seeing anything at all. Carl called out to her, but she didn't respond. It was as though she couldn't hear him. Her hand reached for the door handle, and without hesitation, she opened it, stepping out into the cold night. Before anyone could react, the door slammed shut behind her with a violent force, echoing through the shack. They rushed to the door, but Rachel was gone. There were no footprints in the snow, nothing to indicate where she had gone, just the eerie silence that hung over the wilderness. A sudden gust of wind blew through the doorframe, and Carl felt a chill like he had never felt before. It was as if the night had swallowed her whole, and in her absence, a deep emptiness had settled over them. Mark was next. He had been sitting quietly by the fire, staring into the flames, his face pale and drained of color. His eyes were wide, unfocused, like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had begun muttering to himself, his voice soft at first, but then growing louder, as though he were having a conversation with someone no one else could see. Carl tried to approach him, but Mark's words were frantic now, his breathing shallow. He turned toward Carl. His face contorted in terror, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. "They're here," Mark whispered, his voice quivering. "They're watching us. They want us. They want us all." Before Carl could respond, Mark's eyes snapped wide open, his pupils dilated with fear. He bolted to his feet, his body moving with unnatural speed. "I can't stay here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Without another word, he ran toward the door, just like Rachel had, and before anyone could stop him, he opened it and stepped into the darkness. The door slammed shut again, just as quickly as it had with Rachel. And once again, there were no traces of Mark. No footprints, no sound. Nothing but the unbroken, oppressive silence of the wilderness. The remaining members of the team were too terrified to sleep. Every movement felt like an eternity. Every breath, a conscious effort. Carl sat by the fire, his eyes darting nervously between the dark corners of the shack. Emily was next to him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't spoken since Mark had vanished, her body frozen with terror. They both sat there in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. They could hear the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, a rhythmic crunching in the snow, moving around the shack, circling them. It was impossible to tell whether the footsteps were real or if their minds were playing tricks on them. But the sound felt too solid, too close to be ignored. Carl clenched his fists, trying to steady his shaking hands. He wanted to run, wanted to escape, but where could they go? They were trapped in this hellish place with no way out. The shack felt colder than ever now. The warmth from the fire seemed to be fading, like the flames themselves were growing weaker, as if they too feared what was outside. The whispers in the air grew louder, more insistent. Carl could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. They were everywhere, surrounding them, filling the air with their unintelligible murmurings. He could almost feel their presence, as though the walls themselves were alive, watching, waiting for something. And then, as if in response to their fear, the whispers became clearer. Carl and Emily both stiffened, their hearts racing in their chests. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It wasn't just voices on the edge of their perception. These were words, distinct and clear. "You're next." The words were chilling, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The voices didn't speak to each other, but to Carl and Emily. It was as if whatever was out there, whatever had claimed their team members, was finally making its presence known. It was speaking directly to them, and the message was clear. Carl's breath hitched in his throat as he looked at Emily, his eyes wide with terror. She was staring into the darkness, her face pale, her lips trembling, as she mouthed the words over and over in disbelief. "We're next." The wind picked up again, howling through the shack, and the door rattled on its hinges. The footsteps outside grew louder, closer. Carl felt as though the very earth was shaking beneath him. The walls creaked and groaned, and the shack seemed to tremble as if it was about to. They both stumbled, falling to the ground as the shack shook again, and then everything went still. The whispers ceased, the footsteps stopped. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was nothing but the sound of their own breaths in the thick silence. But just as Carl was about to get up, the door swung open with a deafening screech. They both turned toward it, eyes wide with fear, and standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the moonlight, was a figure. It was tall, thin and pale, like a shadow, a memory of something that had once been alive. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching them, waiting. Carl and Emily backed away, but it was too late. The thing in the doorway stepped forward, and they heard its voice, not in the wind, not in the whispering shadows, but loud and clear, as though it was right next to them. "You're next." And then everything went dark.